Welcome, welcome. Today, I am super excited to be speaking with Emily Johnston. Emily is a life coach, a trainer of life coaching, a mindfulness trainer and practitioner. She's an author and many, many other things, too many to mention or remember in this moment. But today I'm super excited to be talking to Emily about youth and education coaching. It's a field that we're both passionate about and a space that we've both done lots of working. And today Emily's going to be sharing with us the work that she does in this field, but also some of the things that she brings to the space that makes her work so I want to say different, but I guess so tangible for the young people that work with her and so relatable for them. So before I sort of take up all the time, Emily, why don't you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Oh, well, I think you've done a brilliant job already. So yeah, it's really great to be here. Really nice to be in this space with you today, Robert. I think this is something we've been talking about for a while, actually, and it's really nice to be here, really, and to be in this space and talking about working with young people, coaching young people, and particularly within the educational sector, because it's a massively growing area. I think there's a lot of potential in this area, and I think it's also hugely needed. It's yeah, hugely needed at this time.
And when we talk about sort of young people or youth in education, there's two parts to that. I often think there's the youth themselves that are part of the educational system, and then there's the educational system. What are your thoughts around that?
Yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting sort of division there. I mean, young people are nearly always in education. So actually going and seeing them and speaking to them in those educational settings, you get a sense of the limitations they face, the kind of the stresses they're under, and so on. Coaching young people outside of the education system, you're more working with sort of family. You're often working with the parents, or obviously the parents are usually paying, but you are very much working more within the family unit, and so that's a different dynamic. And again, the stresses and strains of that show up too.
Yeah, I remember that when I used to work more so with young people, when you were working with them privately, it was often family coaching, how I would describe it, because you had to work with the system that the young people were sort of within, and that had its own challenges around, how were the parents showing up, how were they being triggered or challenged by the young person within their life.
Mm.
And when you're working within an education sector, yes, the family is still part of that. They're still part of that constellation. But it's often that you've been pulled in because there's something happening in education or educationally that's a challenge that's been thrown into the space. I'm just wondering, are you mainly working with those that are facing challenges, or are you also working with what one might call the gifted and talented, or the kind of the silent middle?
Oh wow. Yeah, not with the gifted and talented. Unfortunately, that'd be nice. No, I generally working within the school environment. I'm generally working with students who are really facing a lot of challenges. Those challenges might be to do with the stresses of academic life, the exams they're facing, and those aren't necessarily, they can be the sort of gifted and talented ones who are feeling a lot of academic pressure, but they also equally and quite often can be the ones that are really struggling, and really finding it difficult to work within those constraints, feeling a bit like a kind of a square peg in a round hole. So there's those elements. There are those students who are being challenged by the academic or the educational system that they're in. There's also other aspects to this. So young people who are challenged by relationship, um, whether that's with the friends they have or their family. So I do see a lot of students within the school environment who are challenged at home, and it's coming into their school space, educational space. So it's showing up in many different ways. Teachers have picked up on it or whatever, and then they're bringing that to me. And alongside all that, you've also got aspects around mental health as well. So anxiety in teenagers is soaring. It's a huge problem at the moment. So definitely elements of that come into the work that I do.
So So we're talking about, I guess, the coaching world, but you talked about mental health there. So how do you sort of manage these elements, or do you even bother about separating them out, and do they all sort of come in within the package of what Emily brings into those spaces?
Yes, I would say they all come in, and often one against the other. So, you might have a student who shows up with having a really, difficult relationship with parents, but then alongside that, oh well, a family member has died, and that's what's causing bereavement as well, or there's anxiety because of situations that they're facing, and so on. So yes, definitely mental health just comes in as part of the whole package. And as a coach, we can definitely meet those challenges around mental health. Um, but I would kind of, I suppose I, you know, just check that and say, uh, as a coach, I'm always on the lookout to see where my competencies are. What's the limit of the work that I can do with somebody, and at which point, what point do I say, this particular individual needs more than I can offer, and then we explore ways to get them help.
That's really interesting because you're working with these young people, and I know that when you coach with young people, there's a lot of work that goes into building that relationship, just because of the very nature of their opinion around authority and whether you're the authority figure or not, and that whole how do we create equality in that space when there's often suspicion, I guess, around why we're there and what's going on. And you spoke about, am I the right person, and do we need to hand it over to somebody else? And I know that that can be really challenging because of the work that goes into building the relationship when we say, okay, you're going to go and work with somebody else now.
Mhm.
And that sense of loss or separation or even abandonment that somebody might feel. I remember speaking with Pat Dolan many years ago about youth mentoring, and him saying that the endings of those relationships are so key not to create or cause or trigger abandonment issues within the young people that we work with. So how do you manage that sort of, if you need to shift them over to work with somebody else?
Yes, yes, that's a really good question. I think uh, the rapport and the relationship that you build up with a young person is fundamental to the work that you do with them. And I think needs almost far more work than you would with with an adult in the space. Adults are often more used to creating relationship and often have many different forms of relationship within their life. They've built up the skills for that. They also understand that in a coaching relationship, it's a professional relationship to some extent, and they know how to manage that. But in a relationship, in a coaching relationship with a student, um, you are there not just as their coach, you're there as their equal, but you're also there as an adult in the space, creating a safe environment for them to open up. So it's not it has many levels. There are many kind of layers to that relationship that you have with that student. And when it becomes, when it comes to the point where you feel they might need something more, um, that's very much a conversation that I will have with a student, and then also with maybe their parents or so on. I would say in my experience, it comes down to a number of things. Firstly, there is the conversation that you have with them, and sometimes they will be in a space where they recognize that they need something more. You've got them through coaching to that point where they recognize they need something more, so that's fine. And they are happy to move on. Sometimes it's alongside. So sometimes I will continue to see the student, even though they're also getting some form of therapy or counselling outside the school environment. So I will still continue to keep that relationship with the student to support them, particularly in the school environment, whilst they're also getting other support outside of the coaching. And even if I do say goodbye to a student, even if that relationship does come to an end and I'm passing them off to another another professional, I will always say that my door is always open. So if they would like to come back, this is a point at which they're going off to have to see somebody else. But if they feel they need to come back and talk to me again, that's absolutely fine, and we kind of negotiate that to some extent. But another thing about relationships with clients, young people, is that they often don't want to leave as well. And so sometimes part of the coaching is around, you're actually in a good space. Maybe we need to just, gently wind down these regular sessions and start to move away from this, very regular, these very regular coaching sessions. So,
I wonder what that is for them, about the not wanting to leave and the wanting to continue that.
I think there's a number of things. I think they've built up, it's building up a relationship with an adult, which they've, in a way that they've not had before, which I think is very, very valuable. And having that safe space to be able to talk, again, hugely valuable, not something they necessarily have anywhere else in their lives. So there's a sort of feeling into what's actually going to be useful and productive for that particular student. But to be honest, quite often, sometimes it's also just a case of they're going to get out of Spanish or French for an hour, whatever. So that's nice too.
There's their own ulterior motives at play within it as well. And throwing this term of young people and youth around, and when you think about working with young people, what's the sort of age range that you would define a young person into for the coaching work that you do?
The young people that I work with tend to be from about the age of 11 up to 18. I do know coaches who work with younger students, younger people than that. But I would say my expertise is really in sort of that sort of age 10, 11 up to 18. And even within that, there's a huge variety of maturity, of understanding of the ways that you can work with different age groups. The work that I would do with an 18-year-old will be very different to the work that I do with an 11 or 12-year-old, just by the nature of where they are at developmentally.
I want to talk about that sort of developmental stuff in a moment, but I'm just curious about this idea of, what might you bring to an 11-year-old in terms of coaching that's very different to an 18-year-old in terms of what the coaching might look like?
Well, I think for a start, the problems are very different. I mean, coaching 11-year-olds often revolves around, no one wants to be friends with me. And how do I create friendships, particularly if they come into a school and they're starting off in that year 7 and it's all new and it's all scary. They've just come from junior school, primary school. So there's that kind of the problems are very different. Whereas when you're working with an 18-year-old, they're on the cusp of adulthood. They are raring to go quite often, or they're in a space of, oh my goodness, I'm going to be pushed out into the world and I'm terrified. But there's very much more a sense of independence with an 18-year-old. There's very much more a sense of identity as well, individual identity. Whereas we're working with an 11-year-old, their identity is still very much still caught up in the family dynamic, in the mindset of the family. And you've got everything in between.
That's really interesting, because I guess as an 11-year-old, it's much more relational in terms of, how do I relate with others and how do I relate and understand myself? And as myself is changing, what do these changes mean? Whereas an 18-year-old, although they're still in that shifting and developmental change phase, there's much more identity, or I guess there's much more willingness to forge an identity at that age. I guess I think around that time we're sort of going, I am me. Who is this me? Who's my tribe? Let me get into my tribe. Whereas an 11-year-old, everybody's part of their tribe still, and they're just beginning to notice that they're being ushered out of spaces. I mean, that's a huge generalization, but that's kind of part of the framing of it, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's also that identity with family as well. When you're about 10, 11, you're still very much working from the same values, the same ideas of your family as a whole. particularly, strongly from your parents' point of view. You're working from that point of view. You have the same mindset often as them, and their values and beliefs and so on. But then you see this lovely, extraordinary change happening as they get older, move through their middle teens and into sort of 18, where this vast amount of questioning happens, an exploration into who am I? And I still want hugs, and I still want that kind of interaction and that being mothered or being fathered, but I also very much want my own identity, and I want to work out who I am, and I need that separation. And that just expands as they get older to sort of 18. And like you say, they don't necessarily know who they are, but it's very much that I want to work out who I am. And as a separate entity to this family unit that I've been brought up in. And, who are these people? Who are my parents? Why are they thinking these things? Because I'm not sure I think them too.
And I think that's something as well, though. The older a young person gets through that sort of teen life, they start to question, am I the same as my family? And desiring that autonomy or that difference. I know that when I've worked with parents around this, they found that incredibly challenging, because that sweet boy, girl who wanted hugs last year, this year doesn't want you to go near them, and they find that a real kind of what's happened to them. But that young person is trying to kind of strive out into the world and go, this is who I am, or who am I, and where do I fit in the world? Those, as you say, those questions start to be asked, and those stages that we might think of when we think about that sort of developmental theory that we're going through that time of kind of going part of the family, now I'm on my own, and that adolescence of I'm an adult now, but I don't have adult power. And I think that's one of the other things that is really interesting about working with young people, is that power piece. How do you go about working with and exploring power with young people?
And I think that's one of the huge challenges about working with young people, is that they don't have that autonomy, that external autonomy over what's happening to them, whether they should be in school or not. I mean, when you're working with an adult, you can say, they might decide to change career or change country, or move to the city or whatever, and there's a lot more autonomy, a lot more possibility externally. Whereas when you're working with teenagers, that isn't as flexible. Sure, you might have a student who wants to change school, but again, that comes very much under the guidance of parents and so on, and there's a lot more around that. But generally speaking, their external world is not that flexible. They don't have autonomy in that world, other than small day-to-day stuff. So when you're working with teenagers, it's very much more about exploring and looking at the inner autonomy, and exploring the inner world, and who they are as a human being, and what they hope to be, and how they would like to move on into adulthood. So you're working very much more with the internal world, and how to manage that going through their teens. And we can do that in so many different ways, and we can also be very creative with that too. Yeah.
So, and as you were saying that, I sort of started thinking about, working with the internal and recognizing there's the sort of the hormonal shifts and challenges that are taking place at the same time. And where do we give sort of space, I guess, for those inputs to be happening, because the actual brain is going through change as well. So it's not just they're getting older and they're trying to find autonomy, it's that their internal structures are changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, physically they're changing. So there's hormonal changes. We've both been through it. Yeah, it's chaotic. There's physical changes, and because of all that as well, there's mental changes and emotional changes. The emotional world of a teenager is extraordinary, because again they're shifting from this mentality of you know, being part of this small unit, into a much broader, wider world, and the emotional changes that come with that, and the expansion into that, if you like. So there's vast changes, and you know, one of the aspects that I use within coaching teenagers, particularly, is a little bit of psychoeducation around some of these things, because if they can start to notice, oh no, there are hormonal changes. There are times, maybe times of the month, when I might not feel so good, or there may be, you know, experiences that I have as a human being that are actually not necessarily within my control, or need to be controlled. They just are, and to be able to step back and notice those, that, you know, those things are part of who we are as human beings, and the changes that we go through as teenagers. So some of my work will be around that education, as and when seems appropriate and useful, and then just explore how that sits with the client as well.
And as you talk about sort of that education of the young person, it also makes me think about mentoring and how coaching and mentoring when working with young people, that divide, that blurred divide is even more blurred because of the very nature of their knowledge of the world, and what, as an adult coach, that knowledge that you can bring into that space and share with them.
Absolutely. So again, I think, you know, bringing it down to asking permission of the client, the young person, allowing them the autonomy within that space, and to direct that conversation, is still really, really valuable and really important, almost more so than anything else, because it allows them to feel much safer in that space, but also with the support and guidance of being the adult in the space. So checking in and asking permission, but also with the knowledge that as an older human being, there is knowledge that I can offer into the space that might be of use. But again, as a coach, doing it with an offering rather than this is something you have to know. Yeah.
And I guess that this is where that sort of authority boundary is so important as a coach, where we don't slip into becoming the authority, because the young person is often facing that in all of the other aspects of their world. And to enable to make ourselves difference in that, or to create the difference in that, we have to really stay in that space of equality. I know you talk a lot about how rapport is so fundamental, and that equality in the space, in order to create that safe space for that young person. And I sort of remember, and I can also imagine that at times you just want to go, but do this and be like that, because you're only 13, and it's going to be okay once you're 15 or 18 or whatever it is. But having to kind of restrain from that, so that we do keep that equality and allow them to have the autonomy in the space as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So definitely restraint in that space, particularly as, you know, I'm a parent too. I've got kids. You know, my youngest is 19 today. It's his birthday today, and so I know I've been through that as a parent, and I noticed those parental and adult tendencies within that space. And it's really very much about being self-aware in that space, and knowing that the student in front of you is utterly individual in their own right, and needs that space in order to grow into that individuality. And I can offer possibilities and options into that space, as an adult, but also very much as a coach, allowing the client to choose. And you know, there's a lot of work around being super clear in the contracting with students around, that, you know, there may be things that I might, you know, ask permission and then suggest things, but you are quite welcome to come back, and you might try things out, you might come back, and you're quite welcome to come back into the space next week and say, that was a complete waste of time. Because I want them to have the ability to be able to do that, because obviously in a school environment they're so used to, or even in a home environment they're so used to being told what to do, and that's the only way, and that's what you've got to do. So by really laying the groundwork with that relationship, that they can bring anything to the space, and they can disagree with me, and they can come back and say, no, that was useless, or that was a waste of time, or whatever, and that they are in control, as of the number of sessions and how frequently and so on. Constantly putting the direction of the control into their hands in a very explicit way.
And when you talk about that contract, how does the school or the parent fit into that piece of the contracting?
Yes, it's an interesting one. Sometimes the parents are involved, sometimes not. So there will be times when when parents don't necessarily know that their child is coming to see me, because it's useful for the child to have the space to be able to talk freely, and without maybe everyone knowing.
And that's within the school environment.
That's within the school environment, yeah. Obviously, absolutely. Privately, one would definitely need parental consent. So yes, within the school, I'm working actually really closely with the pastoral team. So when I work in a school with students, I'm working so very, very closely with the pastoral team. And whilst maintaining confidentiality with the student in order to allow that safe space, I will also contract around feeding back in a very, very general way to the pastoral team. And by general, I mean very general, like, yes, it's going well. And again, I'll be very explicit with that with the students, because I need them to feel safe. I need them to feel they can say anything. But of course, there's also the overarching element of safeguarding. So we need to be explicit about what's okay, what needs to be passed on without a shadow of doubt. What are my legal duties in that space?
And I would imagine that different schools will have different elements that they will call disclosure that they will want to bring into the contract with you. So you'll kind of have to remember, where am I? What level do they want to operate on? And kind of just hold that in mind in the different environments that you're working in.
Absolutely, yes. And it's yeah, absolutely. So just remembering where you're at and what the contract is, and try and be very much as possible, have a completely confidential space for the students, and contract with the schools around that as much as possible, so that space with the student is as utterly confidential as possible, apart from safeguarding. Yeah.
And you talked there about your own self-awareness as a parent, and I know for myself that being a parent and working with young people, there's all sorts of stuff that can get fired up within us around good parenting, bad parenting, good schooling, bad schooling, for want of better terms, around that field. And how would you suggest to somebody who's new to working with young people, or has a desire to work with young people, to manage the self within that space?
Remember, there are two sides to every story. Always remember there are two sides to every story. And whilst you've got a teenager in front of you and they may be telling you all sorts of, particularly maybe things about going on, that are going on at home, and how they feel they're so unfairly treated and all the rest of it. Whilst I'm very much there on an equal footing with my client in that space, and exploring their story with them, I do have to remember that there are two sides to every story. And if I was to have the parents in the room, they may have a completely different story. As we know, I remember my own teens, and one is quite melodramatic when I was a teenager, and not to say that every teenager will be, but it's important to maintain one's neutrality as much as possible, so not to collude with the client's story, and to remember that there are other viewpoints to this situation. I do get called into meetings with parents, so the pastoral team and myself will meet with parents of students who are having difficulties, and it's very important in that space to remain neutral, to not collude with anyone's story, but to be the observer, to be the reflector, to be the mirror for our clients and possibly for our clients' parents too.
Yeah, I remember talking with Myra Khan about the truths in the space. There's my truth
Mm.
in the space, there's the client's truth in the space, and there's the external truth that may come into that space. And these things may be true for us. That the young person will see that as being very real. The challenges that they're facing in that moment, and the unfairness of life or family or school. But that's not the only truth that exists. It's like there are all of these truths, and they're true to that person. That's their felt and lived experience. And as coaches, we have to recognize that it's true for them, but there will be other truths. As you said, there'll be other worldviews, other perceptions or paradigms at play within this.
Absolutely, yes. And I think there's a certain amount of recognition that as a parent in the space, and seeing a student, you may get, it's just useful to notice how one may get pulled into their story, particularly if they're feeling maybe threatened or in a very difficult position with parents. That's their story. And as a parent, my instinct is to go in and save or rescue or whatever. And I need to recognize that. It is just that. It is my instinct as a parent, and that's fine. That's part of who I am. But as a coach in the space, it is a very different position. And I need to recognize that that's their truth, and that's absolutely fine. But I also need to recognize it's one truth and to explore all the possibilities in that space.
And as you were saying that, it reminded me of the sort of the transactional analysis work at play within that, because we do get pulled into this idea of being that the rescuer, or the rescuer is very much called into that space, and having to really hold on to being the adult and not falling into collusion. And I guess there's a real necessity here for supervision around this work to make sure that one is staying true to that coaching pathway.
Absolutely, really, really important to have supervision. I know to a certain extent there's work that we do in the school I'm working at the moment. There's work we do for each other in supporting each other, and in terms of supervision. But actually, to have an external supervisor who you can discuss those confidential clients with, those confidential stories and situations with, it is hugely important. Absolutely. So yes, regular supervision, very, very valuable.
Because I imagine that hearing the stories of the young people will trigger the stories of ourselves as young people as well, and we need to sort of unpick what's happening in this space. Am I responding from my adult self? Am I responding from my sort of remembered childhood self in that space, which is something I hadn't thought about before, but it's kind of obvious in a way.
Yes, absolutely. And I definitely remember that, have those memories come back up in the space, and thinking, yeah, okay, yeah, just put those to one side, because actually what's present now is really, really important. And just like you would, as an adult coach in a space with an adult client, being triggered by memories, more recent memories. But absolutely, noticing one's own stuff in the space is hugely important, being aware of that and being able to deal with that outside the coaching space. Yeah.
And we talk about the sort of the other work that you bring to the space. We've spoken a little bit about transactional analysis. I know you're a mindfulness teacher and practitioner, so I imagine that some of that will be in their space as well. But I also know that you do the acceptance commitment therapy, or you're trained within that work. I'm just wanting to know a little bit about what that is, and how does that show up in the space.
Absolutely. So it's a really interesting area, and I've done the work, the ACT work with teens, the ACT training with teens, and it's a really interesting area because it brings together, for me, it brings together large aspects of coaching, but also mindfulness into the space as well. And it has a real plethora of tools that you can bring into the space with teenagers. So very much from a coaching point of view rather than a therapeutic point of view. And it's just very, very practical and really, really useful, a useful way of working with teenagers. So yes, it definitely talks about, within that realm, we talk about the building of rapport, the building of a relationship with students, but it's also very practical elements around creating choice for our students as well, and what that looks like, what it would look like to be their ideal self, and what would take them towards that, what actions, what thoughts, what emotions take them towards that, what takes them away from being that. But also being able to, in that space, in a very mindful way, be able to step back from all that inner world that they have, and be able to notice it and give it some space and accept that actually these are all parts of who I am as a human being, and they're not necessarily always there and always have to be in the space. It's part of being human, being able to notice those things and accept that they are part of who we are as human beings. And I think there's something interesting around working with teens is that, as I've said before, these emotions that come into the space, which they may not have experienced before, let's face it. When we become teenagers, we suddenly experience this vast, overwhelming amount of emotion quite often that we've not necessarily experienced before in childhood. And to be able to, and using a lot of the techniques that we use in ACT therapy, is to be able to manage those emotions, to be able to notice them, to be able to not build on them, but to just be able to sit with them, and to accept that this is part of the human experience, without adding to it and exacerbating it.
So you're going to be doing some work with us around training adults who want to coach with young people, and I'm just wondering about the sort of the therapy end of that, because we're talking about training coaches. We're talking about ACT. There's the acceptance, commitment therapy, and is there a need for those therapeutic interventions? Because I imagine as a coach, you might be listening to this and go, "Oh, but I don't know that stuff. Can I still coach young people, or do I have to know that stuff?" What's your thoughts around that?
I would say you don't need to be a therapist to work with teenagers. Absolutely not. The aspects of ACT that I bring in are, the very, very congruent with coaching. And as we know, there's a huge overlap between therapy and coaching, and there are so many. Basically, coaching came from therapy, right? I mean, it originated in the therapeutic world. So there are definitely elements of therapy that we bring in and make part of the coaching space, and can be really, really powerfully used, in fact. So the one of the key players in ACT is a guy called Russ Harris, who is also, he is a ACT. So he's an ACT therapist, but he's also a life coach. So he very much talks about this in coaching terms as well as therapeutic terms. So there are crossovers, and working with teenagers, you're undoubtedly going to come across elements of mental health and emotions. So what I would say to that is, yes, as coaches, we can definitely work with those elements in a coaching way, but we're accessing tools that have also been used by therapists too.
I guess it's really similar to cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral coaching. They're pulling from the same source of thinking, but they're being applied to different areas of somebody's challenge, and somebody in different areas as to the autonomy or the sort of the okayness of somebody that we're working with.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And so with people sort of listening to this and thinking, oh, okay, I might like to do some of this work. What might they expect from spending some time with you in that sort of learning environment about working with youth and education?
So some of the aspects we want to cover in that it will be looking at the neuroscience of teenagers, because they are neurologically at a very different space from us as adults and from where they were as children. So looking at the neuroscience of teenagers, which is fascinating. Slightly alien, no. Really, a really fascinating area. They're in such a state of flux and change. So we will look at the neuroscience of teenagers, what's going on in the teenage mind, growth mindset as well, what it looks like to be in a growth mindset. We'll look at some of these aspects of ACT therapy that we can draw on in coaching, looking very much at the relationship that we build up with young people in the space. What can we do in the space to really form that relationship, which is not necessarily easy. I mean, a number of students I've had who get in and are like, yeah, and or won't even give you eye contact. So there will be a lot of work that we need to do around that. And we'll also be looking at emotional resilience, how we build emotional resilience with teenagers, because that's a huge area of growth, I think, within the coaching world, and also much needed element in coaching teenagers. And I think also with the aspect of education, we need to look at how we contract with educational facilities, what it looks like to work in an educational facility. And they will vary. I mean, there's going to be a huge amount of variation in how we can work within educational settings, but we can have an exploration of what that could look like and how you might, as a coach, want to approach those educational settings, and how you might like to put your point of view across in terms of how you want to work with students in an educational setting.
Emily, it's been absolutely wonderful having this conversation with you. I always enjoy our conversations around this work. And, if somebody wants to continue this conversation with you, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Well, I'm an Animas, so yes, talking to me through Animas, that's absolutely fine. But also my website is emilywellbeing.co.uk, so you can contact me through that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for today, Emily.
Pleasure. Lovely to speak with you, Robert.
Take care.
Take care.